A man drops dead holding a telegram. No poison, no wounds. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Tell me, where in the world are you unraveling this mystery from? I always look forward to reading your comments. Let's begin. It was a biting morning in late November when Sherlock Holmes stood silhouetted at the window of our shared Baker Street lodgings, the tip of his dressing gown brushing the heel of his Persian slipper. Outside, a sickly light fought its way through the mist that coiled like a serpent around the gas lamps, refusing to disperse even as the day dragged onward. Holmes had been particularly withdrawn for several days, emerging only for pipe tobacco and a daily interrogation of the morning's Times, as though he were hunting for some elusive cipher nestled between advertisements for hair tonic and shipping timetables. I had just returned from breakfasting with a colleague at the Royal College of Surgeons when a commotion below drew our attention. A cab, the paint still wet from the rain, pulled up sharply against the curb. From it emerged Inspector Tobias Lestrade of Scotland Yard, hat askew, his face uncommonly pale. Before Holmes could even issue his customary groan of disdain, the doorbell rang. "Lestrade," Holmes said coolly, before the door had opened, "is 10 minutes earlier than I expected him. I trust it's a corpse rather than another forged will this time." I opened the door to find Lestrade already halfway up the stairs, his boots wet and the lapel of his coat bearing a smear of reddish mud from some hurried departure. "I'll say this, Mr. Holmes," he said without preamble. "If this one doesn't interest you, I shall resign my commission on the spot and take up fishmongering." "That would be a loss to neither law nor haddock," Holmes murmured, waving him to the fireside. "Speak, man. What have the clouds disgorged?" Lestrade glanced at me with an expression I could only interpret as nervous anticipation, then drew a folded sheet of paper from his inside coat pocket. "This arrived at Scotland Yard precisely at 8:30 this morning. A telegram. It was meant for a Mr. Ambrose Duval, solicitor, of Gloucester Place. The problem, Mr. Holmes," he added, voice tightening, "is that Duval was discovered dead at precisely 8:20. His manservant found him slumped across his breakfast table. No signs of trauma, no injury, no theft. He was simply gone." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A heart attack, perhaps." "That's what we thought too, until the medical examiner turned pale. He says Duval was perfectly healthy. Heart like a racehorse." "Interesting. And the telegram?" Lestrade handed the paper over. Holmes scanned it once, then again, this time aloud. "The consequence of betrayal is silence. You have 3 hours. Mem." Holmes let the sheet flutter to the table as if it were contaminated. "Well, well," he murmured. "This is not a simple matter of postal delay, is it?" "No, sir. The message was sent at 7:58 from a public office in Soho Square. It arrived at 8:30, but Duval was already dead by 8:20. We checked all the clocks. There's no margin for confusion." "Which suggests," Holmes said, steepling his fingers, "that either someone sent a warning to a man they knew would not receive it, or they sent a theatrical flourish to accompany a crime already done." "But how did he die?" I asked, taking the telegram from the table again. "Surely no message, however ominous, can stop a man's heart." "That," Holmes said, eyes gleaming now, "is precisely the problem. The telegram alone did not kill him, but it tells us that someone knew he would be dead when it arrived." He stood abruptly, slipping on his coat in that swift, fluid motion that always signaled the beginning of a chase. "Watson, fetch your hat. Lestrade, you'll join us. We are going to Gloucester Place to look into the curious matter of a dead man, a late telegram, and a promise of silence." "But what are we looking for?" Lestrade asked. Holmes was already halfway down the stairs. "A ghost," he called back, with exceptional timing. By the time our hansom cab clattered its way toward Gloucester Place, the fog had thickened into a grey wall, muting the sound of hooves and blurring even the gaslights into flickering smudges. Holmes sat forward with uncharacteristic stillness, his gloved fingers pressed lightly together, eyes half closed, not in slumber, but in some deep and complex calculation. Lestrade, on the opposite bench, was thumbing through a small notebook, lips moving silently, perhaps rehearsing a timeline that already felt riddled with too many uncertainties. I found myself studying Holmes's profile, as I had countless times during our adventures. There was something keener in his expression this morning, a quality of anticipation tinged with something bordering on irritation. As the cab rounded the final corner, he suddenly murmured, "Time, Watson, is the one accomplice who cannot lie. If this message was meant to warn Duval, we must ask why it arrived too late, and if it was meant for his corpse, we must ask what theater the killer intended us to witness." A few moments later, we pulled up in front of number 73 Gloucester Place, a modest but well-kept townhouse with pale stone steps and polished brass fittings. A uniformed constable stood at the foot of the stairs, rocking on his heels, his breath steaming in the air. "Detective Inspector," the constable greeted Lestrade, nodding as he opened the door. "You've come back fast." "I brought Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied. "Let no one in or out unless he says otherwise." Inside, the warmth of the entrance hall was jarringly domestic. Coats hung neatly on pegs, the scent of polish and recent toast lingered in the air. A thin, balding man in shirt sleeves approached nervously from the drawing room. "Doctor." "Watson?" he asked timidly, recognizing me from Lestrade's introduction. "I'm Forbes, the manservant. I found Mr. Duval. He's still in the breakfast room, sir, just as we left him." Holmes gave a small nod. "No one else has touched the body?" "No, sir, only Dr. Renshaw. He came at once when I ran to fetch him. But when he couldn't explain the death, he said to call Scotland Yard." "Quite right," Holmes said. "Now, Mr. Forbes, if you would be so kind as to bring me any unopened post that arrived this morning, as well as yesterday's letters. I'd also like to see your employer's appointment book, if he kept one." "Of course, sir," Forbes said, and padded quickly upstairs. The breakfast room was a small, book-lined chamber overlooking a private garden gone dark with November damp. Mr. Ambrose Duval sat hunched forward in an armchair at the head of a circular table, a breakfast plate pushed to one side, tea grown cold at his elbow. His eyes were closed, lips slightly parted, his complexion pale but peaceful, eerily so. There was no sign of violence, no spilled food, no contorted limbs. His cravat was neatly tied, the cuffs of his dressing gown unstained. "Cause of death undetermined," Lestrade murmured, gazing at the body with discomfort. "It's the serenity that's unsettling." Holmes crouched beside the chair, drawing a magnifying lens from his pocket and running it along the sleeve and fingertips of the deceased. "Indeed," he said absently. "No struggle, no trauma, yet this man was, by all accounts, robust and hearty." "Did the doctor note anything of interest?" "No bruising, no discoloration, no odor." His pulse had ceased cleanly. Holmes sniffed at the teacup and tilted it gently to inspect the dregs. "Chicory, a touch of clove. Nothing unusual, no residue of opiates." He moved to the breakfast plate. Scrambled eggs, lightly touched, and a slice of toast with raspberry preserve. No indication of vomiting. It seems, Watson, that death came like a whisper. I approached and performed a cursory check for telltale signs of poisoning, cyanosis, constricted pupils, lividity patterns, but saw nothing conclusive. It was, in a word, baffling. Holmes rose suddenly and turned to the mantel, where a small silver-framed photograph stood, a woman with pale eyes and a confident expression. On the frame's back was scrawled a name, M.H.D. Holmes's brow furrowed. "Forbes said Duval lived alone, didn't he?" I asked. "Indeed. This may be a sister or cousin, or perhaps something less formal." Just then, Forbes returned with a bundle of envelopes and a slender leather-bound volume. "His post, sir, and his calendar. He always jotted brief notes for the day." Holmes took them wordlessly. He thumbed through the letters first. Household bills, a note from a client regarding probate, and one unopened envelope from a Miss Helen Darrow posted yesterday from Bath. Miss Darrow, Holmes mused. A woman's hand, unmistakably. He opened it carefully, revealing a note written in violet ink on perfumed paper. He read silently for a few moments, then folded it and slid it into his coat. No reply to this will be necessary, he said to no one in particular. Now let's see what Duval had planned for this morning. He opened the appointment book to the most recent page. The entry for today read only, 8 a.m. Telegram from M. 9 a.m. Meeting, H.G. arrives. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The victim expected this telegram. Not only expected, it was important enough to note in advance. But why anticipate a message that would, by all appearances, carry a threat? "And who's H.G.?" Lestrade asked. "That," Holmes said, already moving toward the hallway, "is a question worth pursuing. But first, let us speak to the telegraph office." Before we could leave, the front door rattled, and the constable reappeared. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said to Lestrade, "but there's a gentleman here asking after Mr. Duval. Says he had an appointment. Name's Harold Green." Holmes smiled thinly. "Ah, our H.G. arrives precisely on time, though, regrettably, too late." Moments later, a tall, lean man in his early 30s entered, removing a rain-spotted hat. His overcoat was tailored, his boots polished, and his mustache precise. But there was a nervous energy about him, a faint quiver in the lip, a darting of the eyes. When he spotted the constables and the drawn faces of Lestrade and myself, he paled. "Something's happened," he said hoarsely. "Mr. Duval." "I'm afraid you're too late, Mr. Green," Holmes said. "Your client has passed away." Green staggered back a step. "Dead. But I just spoke with him yesterday. We were finalizing an acquisition." "You were expected at 9, Holmes said. "Tell me, what sort of business were you conducting?" "Legal filings. Mr. Duval was managing the paperwork for a property transfer. I'm acquiring a house in Dulwich. He had the final documents." "Documents which might now be in jeopardy," Holmes observed. "You wouldn't happen to know who M might be, would you?" Green blinked. "M? Yes. Duval expected a telegram from them this morning. It arrived after his death." Green shook his head slowly. "Number, I'm sorry. That doesn't mean anything to me." Holmes studied him for a moment, then said, "Very well. Please leave your card with the constable. We may have further questions." As Green departed, Lestrade leaned in. "What do you think? Genuine, or putting on a show?" "He is not the killer," Holmes said without hesitation. "But he may be the bait." He turned to me then, suddenly animated. "Watson, we must go to Soho Square. I wish to see who sent that telegram, and why they timed it so perfectly to reach a man who could no longer read." We left the house with haste, the last thing I heard being Forbes quietly re-entering the breakfast room as if afraid to breathe near the silence that Mr. Duval had left behind. The fog followed us like a hound as we made our way south by cab to Soho Square. Holmes sat with his fingers drumming lightly against the polished handle of his cane, eyes trained on some invisible constellation only he could chart. I had come to recognize the signs of his mental machinery at work. The stillness of his shoulders, the furrow forming just beneath his right eyebrow, the quiet disregard for anything that did not align with the immediate problem. He had not spoken since we left Gloucester Place, and I did not interrupt him. Lestrade, seated beside me, cleared his throat now and again as though debating whether to ask a question, but even he seemed to sense that Holmes had no room for idle speculation. It wasn't until we turned into Soho Square, the clatter of our wheels dulling against the paving stones, that Holmes stirred. "Timing," he said, more to himself than to either of us, "is either the servant of intention or its enemy. This telegram was not late by accident. It was timed with such precision as to be deliberate. A message meant to arrive posthumously is not a warning, but a statement. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. A statement to whom? Holmes's expression did not change. To us, I suspect. Or perhaps to someone yet unknown who is meant to discover it. Come. The cab drew to a halt outside a narrow building with a brass sign reading Postal and Telegraph Office, Soho Division. Inside, the space was cramped and smelled faintly of ink and hot metal. Behind a tall wooden counter stood a clerk in his middle years, spectacles perched low on his nose, sorting sheaves of paper with mechanical diligence. Holmes approached and removed his card from his breast pocket. I'm Sherlock Holmes. You received a telegram this morning, sent at precisely 7:58 a.m., addressed to Mr. Ambrose Duval of Gloucester Place. I would like to see the original submission slip and to speak with the clerk who accepted it. The man blinked. 1 moment, sir. He vanished behind a partition and shortly returned with a thin file and a junior clerk who could not have been more than 20. The youth looked nervous, his collar slightly askew. Sir, I took the message myself, he said. Young Mr. Tillotson, if you please. I remember it well. It came in just before the hour. Holmes gestured. Tell me exactly what occurred. Every detail. Well, sir, I was on duty from 7 sharp. At 7:58, just as you say, a man came to the window. Tall fellow, dark coat, collar turned up, soft hat pulled low. He didn't say much. Slid the form across and paid in coin. His voice was soft, but the tone, well, cold, if I may say so. Holmes took the slip from the file and examined it. The handwriting was tall and looping, confident. The message itself, identical to the copy Lestrade had shown us. The consequence of betrayal is silence. You have 3 hours. M. Did he sign the form? No, sir. We don't require signatures, just payment. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did he linger? Look about? Did he seem in haste? The young man shook his head. No, sir. Calm as anything. No fidgeting, but he did something strange. He glanced at the clock behind me as he left. Not once, but twice. Curious, Holmes murmured. He wanted to be certain of the time of dispatch, which means he knew precisely when Mr. Duval would die, or at least when the message must be received. Lestrade stepped forward. What about the paper? Anything unusual? Holmes lifted the form to his nose. Standard stock. But look. See the pressure here, Watson? He handed it to me. The letters had been written with firm, steady pressure, as if the writer were used to signing documents of consequence. A man accustomed to ink, to formality. A lawyer, a banker. Holmes turned to Tillotson again. Did the man wear gloves? Yes, sir. Black ones. Looked like suede. And his face? Covered in shadow, but he had a bit of a limp, I think. Right leg, only slight. Holmes stood back, satisfied. Thank you. One final thing. Was he carrying anything? A leather folder, brown, thick like he had papers inside. Holmes handed the slip back and gave a brief nod of thanks. As we stepped back out into the street, the fog having thinned only slightly, he said, A lawyer, perhaps, or someone masquerading as one. Either way, he came not only to send a message, but to mark time, to leave a footprint on the hour. Lestrade pulled his coat tighter. Still doesn't tell us how Duval died, or who M is. It does something better, Holmes said. It tells us where to look next. We returned to Baker Street briefly, Holmes requiring access to his reference files. He vanished into the sitting room and began extracting ledger after ledger from the shelves beneath the violin case, placing them in precise stacks on the table. I made coffee. Lestrade stood awkwardly by the hearth, trying not to look as though he were watching Holmes at work. After nearly 20 minutes of searching, Holmes opened a thick black volume and laid it flat. Here, he said. Ambrose Duval was, until 2 years ago, the retained solicitor for a firm called Mayweather Holdings. Commercial property agents, their director at the time, Marcus Hellstone, M.H. He turned the book around. A clipped newspaper article had been pasted to the inside cover. The headline read, "Hellstone removed amid embezzlement allegations. No charges filed." Lestrade leaned in. "You think this is RM?" "I think it's the beginning of a useful hypothesis," Holmes replied. Duval quietly severed ties after the scandal, but perhaps the ties were not entirely cut. Perhaps there was knowledge left unsaid, papers left unfiled. I rose. "The letter from Miss Helen Darrow, could it be connected?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent, Watson. That letter was not a sentimental note. It contained a veiled plea. She warned Duval not to attend a meeting today, not to go through with the exchange. Her phrasing was elliptical but pointed. I suspect she feared what would happen if Duval revealed something." Lestrade exhaled. "So we've got a dead man, a timed warning, and an old associate with a motive for revenge." Holmes was already shrugging on his coat. Not revenge. Preservation. If Duval had proof of Hellstone's prior wrongdoing and planned to expose it, perhaps even sell it to a rival, then Hellstone would have every reason to silence him. We returned to the street. The fog was lifting at last, chased by a stiffening wind, and the streets gleamed wetly beneath the pale noon sun. As we hailed another cab, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "We are going to Mayweather Holdings. If Hellstone is there, he will deny everything, but if he is not, then I will believe we are already too late to stop the next move." Lestrade looked grim. "You think there'll be another death?" Holmes's reply was quiet. "Number, I think there's already been another betrayal." The cab rattled eastward through the thinning fog, carrying us deeper into the commercial heart of the city, where office buildings with stern stone facades loomed in close rows, their windows watching the streets like unreadable eyes. Holmes sat forward, eyes fixed ahead, but not with urgency. It was the kind of tension I'd come to recognize. The quiet before a strike, the coiling of his mind just before a theory was tested in the crucible of fact. Mayweather Holdings, when we reached it, presented the image of a firm that had weathered scandal with polish rather than penitence. The brass nameplate gleamed on a black lacquered door, flanked by columns and etched glass. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and ink. A young man in a stiff collar looked up from a reception desk, startled by our entrance. "Good day," Holmes said briskly, flashing his card. "We require a word with Mr. Marcus Hellstone if he is in." The clerk's hands faltered on the ledger. "Mr. Hellstone no longer holds a position here." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Since when?" 2 weeks, sir. He sold his remaining shares and resigned. The partners held a meeting. He was given a settlement, I believe, and cleared out his office last Wednesday." "And where did he go?" Well, that I don't know. He didn't leave a forwarding address. I believe his personal business was handled through a solicitor." "Ambrose Duval, perhaps?" The clerk blinked. "Yes, sir, that was the name. I saw the letterhead on a few of the envelopes." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Was there anyone else in communication with Hellstone here in the days before his departure?" The clerk hesitated. "I did see him speaking with Mr. Lamson, one of the junior partners. They were in the conference room for some time the day he left." Holmes turned slightly. "We would like to speak to Mr. Lamson. It is a matter of some urgency." The man hesitated, then disappeared down the corridor. A few minutes later, he returned with a square-shouldered man in his late 40s, spectacles glinting and his face drawn with the tautness of someone who'd spent too long trying not to be involved in something regrettable. "You'll forgive the abrupt visit," Holmes said as Lamson greeted us. "We are investigating the death of Mr. Ambrose Duval." The man paled. "Good heavens, he's dead." "Found this morning at his home," Holmes said, "under circumstances that strongly suggest intent rather than misadventure. You were one of the last known associates of Marcus Hellstone. We believe Mr. Helstone and Mr. Duval may have remained in contact following the former's resignation from your firm. Lamson drew back, visibly uneasy. I don't know anything about that. But you spoke with Helstone just before he left? Yes. He said he was tired of the game. That he'd had enough of London, the scrutiny, the looks. He spoke of heading abroad? Portugal, I believe. Did he mention anything about documents left in Duval's possession? Number, but now that you mention it. Lamson looked up sharply, as if something had just occurred to him. There was a man who came in last week asking for Helstone, said he had a delivery. When I told him Mr. Helstone no longer worked here, he looked startled, angry, perhaps. I thought it odd. Did you get his name? I didn't ask, but he left a card for Helstone. I passed it along. Do you recall the name? Lamson frowned, thinking. Initials. I'm sure of that. H.G. Something. Green. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Harold Green, I said quietly. Lestrade stepped forward. Green claimed he had a legal arrangement with Duval. Property transfer. But what if that was a cover? What if he was working for Helstone all along? Holmes was quiet for a moment, then turned back to Lamson. Thank you. If you should recall anything else, notify Scotland Yard directly. This matter may yet prove more tangled than it appears. Outside again, Holmes walked several paces before speaking. Helstone clears out, severing ties cleanly, and disappears. Green appears at Duval's door the very morning of his death, claiming a transaction. Yet we now learn he was looking for Helstone only days prior. Lestrade frowned. Could he be working both sides? Trying to retrieve something for Helstone while posing as a legitimate client? Possibly, Holmes murmured. Or possibly Green is the instrument Helstone used to deliver a final message, or worse, a dose. I looked over. You believe Duval was poisoned after all? I believe we need more facts. We have the means. Telegram. We have the motive. Exposure. But the method remains unclear. Green's role must be re-examined. As we climbed into the cab once more, Holmes gave the driver a new direction. Watson, we are going to pay a call on Miss Helen Darrow. The woman who wrote to Duval? Indeed. She knew of the danger and warned him. That makes her either a potential victim or an accomplice. We arrived at a small but well-kept lodging house off Tavistock Square. The landlady, a no-nonsense woman with ink-stained hands, told us that Miss Darrow was in and had taken no callers that day. Holmes presented his card once more, and we were shown into a drawing-room that smelled faintly of rosewater and books. Helen Darrow was perhaps in her early 30s, with pale, fine features and the air of someone who lived carefully between the margins of things. Her gaze shifted from Holmes to Lestrade to me, and her hands gripped the back of a chair as she stood. I suppose you've come about Ambrose, she said softly. I saw the notice posted outside his chambers. I had a dreadful feeling. You wrote to him yesterday, Holmes said, a letter urging him not to attend a meeting. You warned of an exchange. What did you mean? She took a deep breath. I worked as Mr. Duval's secretary for 4 years. Even after I left, I kept in touch. I knew he had materials, evidence of past dealings with Mr. Helstone that he'd kept hidden. He spoke once of using them, selling them even, to recover losses from the firm's collapse. Selling them to whom? Holmes asked. I don't know, but someone had offered a price. Was he frightened? Not at first, but in recent weeks, yes. He said someone had begun watching the house, that messages arrived unsigned. I told him it wasn't worth it, that silence might be safer. Did he mention Harold Green? She shook her head. Number, that name means nothing to me. Holmes leaned forward. Miss Darrow, do you believe Ambrose was capable of blackmail? She looked away, eyes fixed on the hearth. He was proud. He had been ruined publicly, despite never being charged. I think, yes, he wanted restitution. Do you still have copies of the files you typed for him? Only summaries, notes. I burned most of the rest after I left. Bring me the summaries. Tonight. Baker Street. If they exist, they may be the only key left. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Outside, the light was beginning to fade again. Lestrade turned up his collar. So what now? Now, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. We return to Green. He lied to us. Of that I am now certain. And if he came not to receive documents, but to retrieve something Duval was never meant to release, then he may still be carrying the very key Hellstone meant to bury. What if he's vanished? I asked. Then, Holmes said coldly, we hunt. It was nearing 5 o'clock when we arrived back at Baker Street, the November sky already darkening into indigo, the lamps beginning to flicker to life along the rain-glossed pavement. Holmes wasted no time. No sooner had the front door closed behind us than he flung his coat aside, lit the fire with a single match, and dropped into his armchair with the grim precision of a surgeon preparing for an autopsy. Lestrade lingered near the window, tapping a finger restlessly on the sill. If Green was the go-between, he muttered, we've no proof. We can't arrest a man for being near a body or carrying a telegram. If he's vanished now, it's all guesswork. Holmes did not look up. There is no guesswork, Lestrade. There is only incomplete information, and Mr. Green's absence will be more telling than his presence. But before we assume flight, we must confirm his footing. I sat across from Holmes, watching as he selected a single file from the stack he'd brought from our earlier visit, and began leafing through it, eyes darting. We'll need to locate Green immediately, I said. If he's left London— He hasn't, Holmes interrupted quietly. Not yet. A man who serves two masters cannot vanish cleanly. He will wait, perhaps to deliver, perhaps to betray. In either case, he must surface. He tapped a page. I had assumed Green came under Hellstone's direction, but what if he didn't? What if Green is the one playing both sides, seeking profit from Hellstone's panic and Duval's desperation? A middleman who decided the pot was worth more if the dealer and the banker both folded. Lestrade turned. You think Green acted alone? I think Green may now be acting for himself, Holmes said. Duval was ready to sell. Helen Darrow's letter confirms that, and Green appeared not as a buyer, but as someone with urgency. He claimed to be acquiring a property. Yet Lamson at Mayweather saw him asking after Hellstone only days earlier. Why? If the matter was legal, Duval could have handled it discreetly. But Green wasn't looking to complete a transaction. He was looking to retrieve something. He rose and crossed to the writing desk, pulling open a drawer. From within, he extracted a thin bundle wrapped in waxed cloth and began preparing a small slip of paper. Watson, he said without looking up, when we were at Duval's home, did you notice what was missing? I frowned. You said there was no struggle. Everything was in place. The food, the telegram, exactly. Everything but the thing he was preparing to exchange. There were no files, no portfolios, no trace of any documents save his appointment book and the single letter. If he had evidence meant for Green, where is it now? Gone, Lestrade said. Green took it, or someone took it from Green. Holmes sealed the paper and rang the bell for Mrs. Hudson. When she appeared, he handed her the envelope. See, this is dispatched immediately to the Yard's registry clerk. I need the known addresses of Harold Green, home, office, any club memberships, and his place of birth. As Mrs. Hudson departed, Holmes returned to the hearth and folded his arms. If we can locate Green before the others do, we may yet retrieve what Duval intended to trade. If not— He let the thought trail off. An hour passed. I prepared tea while Lestrade dictated a brief notice to headquarters. Holmes remained still, eyes closed, his entire frame absorbed in some internal trial. Just past 6, a knock sounded. I opened the door to find Miss Helen Darrow, wrapped in a charcoal-grey cloak, her face pale but resolute. She clutched a cloth-bound ledger close to her chest. I found the summaries, she said quietly. He kept them in cipher. I helped him build it. Holmes extended his hand without rising. Give it here. She crossed the room and placed the ledger into his waiting palm. He opened it carefully and scanned the first page. The handwriting was fluid, the lines marked in pairs, one in ink, one in faint pencil, just offset enough to suggest an embedded code. It's not a simple substitution, she said, watching him. It's layered. He built it from names and dates. The alphabet is displaced according to client initials and court filing codes. But I remember the key. Holmes gave her a single nod of approval, the highest compliment he ever issued. You will sit. You will assist me. I moved aside as she took the corner of the table and began aligning a separate slip of paper beside the ledger. Within minutes, the two of them were murmuring over a pattern of initials, column markers, and accounting symbols. Lestrade stepped beside me. What are we looking for? Evidence, I said. Of Hellstone's embezzlement, presumably. Or perhaps more. This might not be just about money. There's something personal here. Something desperate. At 6:30, Mrs. Hudson returned with a sheet from Scotland Yard. Holmes scanned it quickly. Harold Green maintains a private office on Arundel Street, he said aloud. Second floor. No listed club membership. His residence is in Bayswater. He snapped the ledger shut and stood. We start with Arundel. If Green is there, we confront him. If not, we search the premises. Watson, bring your revolver. That caught me short. You expect trouble? Holmes did not answer. His expression had turned sharp, his eyes glittering with that unnerving anticipation I had only seen when danger was near. It was nearing 7 when we arrived at the narrow building on Arundel Street. Most offices had shuttered for the night. A single gaslight flickered above the door. Lestrade showed his credentials to the porter, and we climbed to the second floor, our footfalls muffled on the worn carpet. The door to Green's office bore a brass plate. H. Green, consultant. Holmes tried the knob. Locked. Without pause, he withdrew a small set of picks from his pocket and went to work. Lestrade exhaled. You'll ruin your reputation one day. Holmes didn't look up. Then I'll open a locksmith shop. The lock gave with a soft click. Holmes entered first, Lestrade second, and I last. The room was dark, musty, and still. A large desk stood near the window, its drawers half open. Papers were scattered across the floor as if someone had searched hastily and left in frustration. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting long shadows. But it was the smell that struck me. Faint, metallic. And then I saw the overturned chair and the motionless foot beside it. Holmes, I said, voice low. Here. Holmes had already seen it. He knelt beside the collapsed figure. Harold Green lay crumpled beside the desk, his eyes staring wide and fixed, mouth slightly parted in an expression of surprised terror. No wounds, I whispered. Again, no sign of struggle. Just like Duval. Holmes moved with practiced calm, examining the man's hands, his throat, the corners of his mouth. He's been dead no more than an hour, he said. That smell, chloroform perhaps, or a variant. Lestrade stood motionless. You think Hellstone's people got to him? I think, Holmes said, standing slowly, that someone wanted to silence the last witness. Green had the documents, or part of them. Whoever killed him didn't find them. They were too late. But where are they? I asked. Holmes looked at the desk again, then to the waste bin. Then he crossed to the coat rack. There, nearly hidden beneath a spare umbrella, hung a satchel, brown leather, scuffed, fastened tightly. He opened it and pulled out a bundle of documents, tied with twine and marked in Duval's handwriting. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He didn't get the chance to sell them. Then what now? Lestrade asked. Holmes turned, still holding the papers. Now, Inspector, we draw the web tighter, and we wait for Marcus Hellstone to realize that his second blade has failed to cut. Holmes said nothing more as he gently closed the flap of Harold Green's satchel and slid the bundle of documents into the crook of his arm. The room was silent save for the faint hiss of the desk lamp and the dull tick of a carriage passing in the street below. Green lay motionless at our feet, his expression fixed in that uncanny mask of final surprise, and Lestrade remained by the door, unmoving, as if afraid to speak in the presence of the dead. "I must send for the yard," Lestrade said at last, his voice low, almost reverent. "Green will need examination. This makes two." Holmes nodded without looking up. "And no visible cause once again. No wound, no rupture, no sign of injection or forced ingestion. Yet another man silenced, not with violence, but with care." I knelt beside the body, checking pulse, breath, then performing a cursory look along the jaw, the fingertips, the whites of the eyes. "There's a faint line under the nose," I murmured, like something sharp pressed there briefly. "But no bleeding, no abrasion." "Efficient," Holmes murmured. "A small vial, perhaps, a saturated cloth, but not chloroform. Watson, you'd smell it stronger, yes?" "Certainly. This is different, something clean and deadly." Holmes straightened. "There are poisons, Eastern preparations, powders that stop the heart in seconds without a trace, the kind used by professionals. We must consider now that Hellstone is not operating alone. He has help, and not of the clumsy variety." Lestrade retrieved the satchel and held it cautiously, as though it might itself be dangerous. "These documents, are they what Duval meant to sell?" Holmes gestured for me to take them. "We'll examine them properly at Baker Street, but I suspect they contain not just evidence of Hellstone's embezzlement, but the names of those who benefited from it, men who stood to lose reputations, fortunes, or more." Lestrade looked again at the dead man and shook his head. Green never got a chance to play either side then. He was holding the knife by the blade the entire time. "Quite," Holmes said. We left the office under constable guard and returned to Baker Street with the satchel secured between us. Miss Darrow was still waiting in the sitting room, though she stood the moment we entered, her hands tightening around her gloves. "You've found him," she said, eyes darting from our faces to the case in my hand. "We found him," Holmes replied, "but not alive. Green is dead. Quietly, professionally, and very recently." She sank back into the armchair without a word. Holmes placed the satchel on the table and untied the cord around the bundle. A rush of thin, yellowing papers unfolded. A dozen or more legal drafts, correspondence excerpts, ledger summaries in Duval's firm hand. Miss Darrow leaned forward. "These are the items he was afraid to mail," she said quietly. "He wanted a meeting, an exchange. Someone paid him to keep these buried, but someone else wanted them uncovered. He was playing both ends." Holmes scanned the first 2 pages, flipping them with deliberate care. "Watson, look here. These names: Sir Everard Cantley, Godfrey Trent, and here, investments routed through Mayweather, then reallocated through shell entities." I took the pages, reading quickly. These are not minor clients. These are political men, connected. If Duval had these, he could have named a half-dozen accomplices in the original embezzlement. Holmes nodded. "And perhaps more. Look, this note. MH to receive 4.2% quarterly under revised agreement, conditioned upon sustained silence. Dated 6 months ago." Miss Darrow paled. "He was still accepting payment?" "No," Holmes said softly. He resumed, accepting payment. After the scandal, someone bought his silence. Then someone else, perhaps Green, offered a better deal. Duval saw a chance to gain again, and that cost him his life. Lestrade cursed under his breath. So Hellstone's trail wasn't just financial, it was layered in politics, blackmail. If this went public, then a man like Hellstone might lose everything. Holmes finished for him, and if Green was meant to deliver these papers or keep them hidden, it's little wonder he was found before he could do either. Miss Darrow took one of the pages and studied the corner. This line here, copy retained. Safety and loss. What does that mean? Holmes frowned. He retained a second copy, or a note of its contents. Perhaps he feared betrayal. He wouldn't carry the only version with him if he suspected Green might double-cross him. Lestrade looked up. So there's more? A duplicate? Where? Holmes was silent a moment. Then, we must return to Duval's house. The breakfast room, precisely as it was. He left something behind. We were back in Gloucester Place within the hour. The constables on duty gave way at Holmes's instruction, and the house, though still draped in its heavy hush of mourning, seemed somehow changed. Holmes moved quickly through the hall and into the breakfast room, where Duval's chair remained empty but undisturbed. He paused by the table, studying the chair's angle, the plate, the cup. Then he dropped to one knee and examined the underside of the table's lip. After a moment, he gave a low exclamation and withdrew a small sealed envelope, taped beneath the edge with surgical precision. I took it carefully, turning it over. The seal was plain red wax. Inside, folded into quarters, was a single page, handwritten. Holmes took it and read aloud. If this reaches another hand, then I am gone. The man who comes for these documents will not be satisfied. He is not Hellstone's, he is hers, she who held the second half of the bargain. I feared him, but I believed her. Fool that I am. A.D. We were silent. Miss Darrow slowly stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the note. He feared. A woman? Holmes looked up slowly, his voice low. He thought Green was working alone, perhaps even for Hellstone. But there was someone else, a woman who controlled the second half of the arrangement. Someone he trusted, or perhaps had trusted once. Lestrade stepped forward. Who? Who had motive? Holmes didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the table, fingers pressing against its edge, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened. There's one more call to make, he said. Watson, do you recall the photograph on the mantel? I blinked. Yes, a woman, framed in silver. The initials on the back, M.H.D. Helen Darrow, Holmes said quietly. Lestrade stiffened. That's impossible. She warned him. She brought us the summaries. She brought us exactly what she wanted us to find, Holmes said. A partial cipher, a key to the story she helped shape. But Duval knew more. He suspected her. She who held the second half of the bargain. M.H.D. He left the photograph there for a reason. We turned as one. Miss Darrow stood in the center of the room, her eyes calm, unreadable. May I sit? She asked. Holmes gestured silently. She lowered herself slowly into the armchair Duval had last occupied. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Holmes as if he were merely another name in a ledger. You were never going to find all of it, she said. Not unless I wanted you to. Holmes's voice was soft, almost admiring. You played both of them. She nodded once. Hellstone paid me to keep Duval quiet. But Duval stopped trusting me. He knew I wanted the papers for myself. So he created copies, left trails, and when Green became too curious, you sent someone else, Holmes said. Someone trained. She did not respond. Lestrade stepped forward. You're under arrest. No, Holmes said quietly. Not yet. She hasn't finished. Miss Darrow looked down at her hands. I wanted it over. I wanted the names gone. But Duval wouldn't let them die. And neither will you now. Holmes stepped closer. Where's the second half? Her lips curled faintly. I burned it. You'll never prove what they did. Holmes stared at her for a long moment. I don't need to prove what they did, he said softly. only what you did. Outside, the first bell of evening sounded through the streets of London, tolling the hour, and inside the quiet house on Gloucester Place, the final silence began to fall. Lestrade moved first. He reached for the manacles at his belt with a sharp intake of breath, but Holmes raised a hand, halting him. Miss Darrow had not flinched. She remained seated in Duval's armchair, her posture composed, her hands still resting gently in her lap. Her eyes met Holmes's with a faint gleam, not of arrogance, but of resolve. She had already accepted what came next. Holmes walked once around the table. Slow and measured, the sound of his boots dulled by the thick carpet. You played a long game, Miss Darrow. You offered Duval comfort, then compliance, then betrayal, each in due measure. What I do not yet see is why you risked so much. Not for money? Not entirely. You had access to these papers years ago. She studied him without blinking. You make it sound so deliberate. Do you think I plotted it from the first time he asked me to type his letters? I think you were patient, Holmes said. You saw what those documents meant. You understood before Helstone did how dangerous they were. Duval was greedy and Green was a fool, but you understood their value. And then, perhaps you realized they could be used to clean the ledger of your own name as well. She gave a soft laugh, almost breathless. Do you know what it was like, being his secretary? All those years, watching every man around me buy indulgence with silence and power. Duval didn't care who got crushed as long as his name stayed dry. Helstone bled the firm white and left others to take the fall. And I typed it all. Every line. I knew who paid and who lied, and who shook hands afterward. Holmes stood still. You could have gone to the authorities. With what? She snapped, the first flicker of anger touching her voice. With documents signed by men who vanished behind Parliament doors? I'd have disappeared in a week. Or worse. So instead, Holmes said calmly, you began rewriting the game. You offered Duval protection in return for his silence. You brokered his blackmail payments, and when he turned, you arranged for Green to retrieve the files, only to eliminate him before he could consider renegotiation. She said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. You trusted Green to do your bidding, but he grew curious. You didn't trust that curiosity. So you sent someone else, a professional, someone trained to kill without question. Still, she was silent, but the muscles in her jaw tensed just once. You didn't kill Green yourself, Holmes continued, but you selected the method. No trauma, no poison traceable by ordinary means. Just a foreign agent with a substance that kills in seconds and leaves the body cold as if sleep claimed it. Lestrade, who had remained by the door all this time, stepped forward now, one hand on the warrant folded in his coat. We'll find this killer, and when we do— Holmes raised a finger. No need. He turned to Miss Darrow again. He's already gone, isn't he? A slow nod. He was waiting outside Arundel Street when we arrived. Saw our cab, most likely, and understood what had happened. He would have left the country by nightfall. He was paid, she murmured. Well, and in advance. Holmes turned to Lestrade. It's over, but we must act quickly to preserve what remains. Lestrade drew the manacles at last and approached Miss Darrow with the solemnity of a surgeon administering ether. She made no move to resist as he slipped the cuffs over her wrists. You are hereby charged, he said, his voice low, with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and accessory to the deaths of Ambrose Duval and Harold Green. You will be held pending inquiry. She stood when prompted, her head high. I expect no leniency, she said quietly. Only truth. As Lestrade escorted her to the front hall, Holmes and I remained behind in the breakfast room. The silence felt heavier than before, as though something vast had passed through and left the air changed. Holmes remained standing, his gaze fixed on the fireplace, one hand resting lightly on the back of Duval's chair. She was not a villain in the traditional sense, he said finally. She wanted to erase the ledger entirely, to burn every name from the page and be done with it. But she left too many versions of the truth alive. She gave us just enough to follow her trail, I said. Was that calculation or guilt? Both, he said. She believed she could control the story if she controlled the documents. That's why she brought us the cipher. Not to reveal everything, but to make us believe she was clean. And when she realized Green might take a third path, she removed him as surely as one edits a line of type. She would have walked away with everything, I murmured, if Duval hadn't left that final message. Holmes gave a slight smile, no joy in it. Even the most careful mind overlooks something. Duval feared her, and his fear proved more precise than his caution. Outside, I heard the creak of Lestrade's carriage wheels retreating down the lane, Miss Darrow now a shadow among the ranks of the accused. Holmes turned and reached for the envelope once more, examining the final line of Duval's hand. He did not name her directly, he said, but he left just enough. A picture, an initial, a veiled confession. That is the mark of a man who knew he was dying and wished to be understood. He handed the paper to me. Take that to the yard, have them preserve it alongside the rest, and see to it that the satchel is locked in evidence. There is more than enough to unseat Helston's legacy, and perhaps a few others along with him. I nodded, taking the page carefully. Holmes remained by the window, arms folded, watching the shadows slide across Gloucester Place. It is a strange thing, he said, more to himself than to me. To solve a case and feel that justice, when it arrives, is only half-earned. Duval was corrupt. Green was opportunistic. And yet in their deaths, they became necessary voices, each carrying a warning the world would rather not hear. I did not reply. The weight of the evening, of the quiet in that house, pressed too heavily against the space for words. Holmes finally turned back to me. Come, Watson, there is nothing more to be done here. Let us leave the ghosts to their silence. And with that, we stepped into the night. The mist had returned by the time we reached Baker Street, curling around the railings and softening the lamplight into a slow flicker. Holmes did not speak during the ride, nor once we stepped inside. He moved with that particular manner I'd seen only a handful of times before. When a case had concluded, yes, but left something unresolved within him, not factually, emotionally. He crossed to the hearth, crouched, and stirred the embers until they flared and lit the room in a muted orange. I removed my coat slowly and hung it by the door, waiting. After several minutes, he rose and moved to the bundle of documents we had recovered from Green's satchel, still laid neatly upon the table. He didn't touch them. He merely studied them, as if trying to determine whether they had grown heavier since we'd last examined them. There are cases, Watson, he said quietly, in which the mind is satisfied, but the soul is not. I sank into my chair. Because she played it too well? No, he said, turning. Because she played it honestly. Her lies were not cowardly. They were not desperate. She believed in them. She thought herself the instrument of justice, even as she silenced two men with her own hand. She didn't strike the blow, I reminded him. She arranged it. He nodded. Which, as you know, is worse in certain respects. A knife driven in anger is different than one delivered by calculation. Outside, the street had grown hushed. London was sinking into that peculiar quiet it keeps just before midnight, when the last of the tavern-goers have settled and the world forgets, for a moment, how loud it is. Holmes paced to the window, then back again. She told the truth at the end, or enough of it. She knew she would be caught the moment Duval's message was found. That tells me she did not intend to escape. She wanted the truth to die with the others, I said. When that failed, she surrendered. Holmes stopped at the center of the rug. She surrendered because she had already done what she came to do. The second half of the documents may be gone, but the ones Green carried are enough to expose Hellstone and the circle around him. Miss Darrow's final act wasn't vengeance. It was punctuation. There was a pause, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantelpiece clock. "And yet," I said slowly, "you don't seem triumphant." Holmes exhaled and crossed his arms. There is no triumph in a conclusion like this. Merely inevitability. Duval died for greed but left a warning. Green died for ambition but carried the truth. And Miss Darrow, she survived for years in the margins of men's corruption, learning the rules so she could break them. "Do you believe her?" I asked, "that she burned the second half of the documents?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "Yes, but I also believe she memorized them." I sat up straighter. "Then they aren't gone." He nodded slowly. "Number. And if she is ever released, she will have the power to ruin what remains. That is the final twist, Watson. This story has no end, only an interval." At that moment, a knock sounded at the downstairs door, a quick, businesslike tap. Not the kind that announced danger, but one that brought consequence. A minute later, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a card on a tray. Holmes plucked it up and read it silently. Then he turned it over and showed it to me. "Sir Geoffrey Anderton," I read aloud. "Parliamentary whip." I recognized the name. He was tied to Helstone's firm during the Mayweather collapse. Holmes nodded. The first name on Duval's list. We stood together as the man entered. Anderton was tall, with white whiskers and a walking stick that he didn't appear to need. His eyes were hard, searching the room with a familiarity that did not seem casual. "Mr. Holmes," he said at last, "and Dr. Watson, I appreciate you seeing me at this hour." Holmes gestured to the empty chair. "When a man of your station arrives uninvited after midnight, Sir Geoffrey, I do not mistake it for courtesy. You've come regarding the files." Anderton sat slowly, his coat settling across his knees like a robe of burden. "I have come regarding discretion." Holmes gave a faint smile, the kind offered by firelight rather than by statute. Sir Geoffrey did not return the expression. "There are names in those papers, Mr. Holmes. Men who were involved, yes, but only to the extent that they believed the firm's survival depended upon what Helston arranged. That is the truth of commerce, the truth of survival." Holmes tilted his head. "Commerce, yes. Survival, perhaps. But not truth. Duval recorded numbers, names, dates, and signatures. If the truth were inconvenient, it is only because it was so precise." Sir Geoffrey shifted. "You will deliver those files to Scotland Yard?" "I already have." A flicker of something, relief, frustration, crossed the old man's face. "Then you understand what that means." Holmes stepped closer, his voice very low. "Yes. It means that for every man who escapes exposure, another will be forced to testify. It means that the stain on Helstone's name will not be buried with Green or Duval. And it means Miss Darrow, though imprisoned, has more leverage than half the House of Commons." Sir Geoffrey's face had turned grim. "She will never be released." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then you have already judged her." "I have judged what she knows, and what she could do with it." There was a long pause. Then Holmes stepped back and folded his arms. "Let me make something clear. I do not intervene in matters of punishment. I do not lobby for clemency. But I will say this. If anything befalls that woman in custody, any accident, any illness, any error of oversight, my files will become public. Everything you fear will be dragged into daylight. That is my counterweight to your discretion." Sir Geoffrey looked at him for a long moment and then rose. "You are a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes." "And you," Holmes replied calmly, "are a fortunate one. Now leave before I ask why your name appears twice in Duval's ledger." The old man froze, just for an instant. Then he nodded once and left. The door clicked shut behind him. Holmes did not move. I turned to him. "You're bluffing. You haven't read far enough to know if his name appears twice." Holmes's mouth twitched. "Perhaps. But if it doesn't, it should." He moved to the table, closed the satchel with finality, and placed it inside the cabinet by the fireplace. Then he sat. "We are no longer solving mysteries, Watson," he said softly. "We are managing consequences." I understood then that this case had reached farther than I had imagined, not only into the shadows of politics and justice, but into Holmes himself. It had left behind no clean victory, no sharp solution tied with ribbon and sealed in wax. Only residue, the kind that lingers long after the fire has gone cold. And so we sat in silence, as London breathed beyond the glass, and the faint smell of ash settled over Baker Street once again. The following morning broke reluctantly. A thin grey dawn pressed itself across the panes of Baker Street, and a persistent drizzle blurred the outlines of passing cabs. Holmes had not slept. I found him in the sitting room, seated precisely where he had been when I retired. Still dressed, still motionless, save for the slight twitching of his fingers as they drummed a slow, thoughtful rhythm on the arm of his chair. A pot of tea had gone cold beside him, untouched. The remains of our fire had collapsed into pale ash. He looked up as I entered, and though his eyes were ringed with fatigue, they burned with that particular brightness that only followed a night of ceaseless thought. "I trust you slept better than London did," he murmured, his voice dry. I poured myself a cup of the cold tea, grimaced at the bitterness, and set it aside. "News?" Holmes nodded to the window. "The morning edition of the Times is 2 hours late. That in itself is news." I went to the door, and sure enough, the slot in the lower panel held nothing. Holmes, without looking, gestured to the cabinet. "I sealed the documents inside last night, all but one page, the last entry Duval made, dated 2 days before his death." I crossed to him and accepted the sheet he extended. The handwriting was familiar by now, firm, fast, and pressed heavily into the paper as if the words bore more weight than he could contain. "I no longer know who holds the knife. The room grows narrower. Green speaks in riddles. H.D. avoids my eyes. I cannot tell if I am still the seller or if I have already been sold." I looked up. He knew. Even before the telegram, he sensed the game was already lost. Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes. Duval made the fatal error of believing he could play 3 sides and remain untouched. But in a game this sharp, Watson, no one stands at the center without bleeding. There was a knock at the door. This time the rhythm was unfamiliar. 3 taps, pause, 2 more. Deliberate, but without urgency. I moved to open it. A young man stood there in a rain-dark coat with no umbrella, though the drops still fell steadily behind him. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished, and under his arm he carried a folder wrapped in waxed paper. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "my name is Matthew Toller. I've been instructed to deliver this personally. No intermediaries." Holmes stood at once. "You're from the registry office?" "No, sir. I used to clerk for Miss Duval, before Miss Darrow took over." He stepped inside at Holmes's gesture and handed over the packet. This was meant to be sent if he failed to check in. He gave it to me 3 weeks ago, said he might be traveling soon. I heard of his death only this morning. I came directly. Holmes took the packet, weighing it in his hands. "Did you read what it contains?" "I didn't dare, but I suspect it's another ledger. He kept 2, you see, one in cipher, one in his own shorthand. It was the only thing he wrote by hand anymore." Holmes nodded. "You did well to bring it." Toller hesitated. "Sir, Miss Darrow. She was kind to me. Generous, but near the end, she began acting strangely. She made me recopy letters, then asked me to destroy the originals. She said it was about client confidentiality. I believed her, but now—" Holmes stepped closer. "Now you suspect she was removing evidence." Toller gave a small, pained nod. "You've done all you can," Holmes said. "Go home. Say nothing to anyone." When the door closed behind him, Holmes sat heavily and slit the seal with his penknife. I moved to sit beside him as he unfolded the top page. The ledger was smaller than the previous bundle, more like a diary, each line numbered and tight, written in a dense, looping shorthand. Duval's private log, Holmes said. No cipher. No performance, just raw truth. He scanned page after page, silent, and I waited. When he finally stopped, he laid the book open and turned it toward me. You'll want to see this. It was a list, short, perhaps 10 names, and beside each, a date, a payment, and a symbol I recognized from one of the prior documents. A red triangle, inked firmly into the margin. I looked to Holmes for explanation. Those are the men who approved the laundering circuit through May weather. Duval marked them separately. These are the ones who stood to lose everything if Hellstone fell. Political men, judges, financiers, and 2, military. I drew in a breath. He was planning to sell this. Number, he meant to use this. Leverage, not for wealth, but for protection. He knew the circle would tighten around him. This was his shield. Green was to deliver the warning, not the weapon. But it went wrong. He hesitated. Duval died. Green was hunted, and the documents came to us. I turned a page. Near the end, a different handwriting emerged, scrawled in pencil, uncertain. A signature, H.D. She found this ledger, I whispered. She read it. She knew exactly what he had recorded. Holmes nodded. And she burned the copy, thinking this one would remain hidden. Perhaps she even convinced herself she had done the right thing. He closed the book. We will send this to Scotland Yard, quietly, with no announcement. Let them extract the names, let them act in silence. I met his gaze. But if it's never made public? Holmes raised a hand. Then it becomes a sword, not a trial. And sometimes, Watson, that is what justice requires. The drizzle had faded. Sunlight, faint but persistent, pushed through the curtains. I cleared my throat. What will become of Miss Darrow? She will stand trial, but not for treason, not for conspiracy beyond the 2 deaths we know. The rest, he tapped the ledger, will remain sealed until needed. We sat in stillness then, the weight of it all coalescing around us. I wonder, I said after some time, if she regrets it. Holmes stared into the hearth. No, he said, but I believe she mourns it. And with that, the case of the telegram that killed a man passed into the long shadow of a memory. Another tangle of silence, deception, and truth, folded quietly into the pages of Baker Street. The following days passed not with fanfare or headlines, but with the slow tightening of unseen threads. True to Holmes's prediction, the ledger from Duval's private archive never made the papers, nor did it spark any courtroom uproar. Instead, it moved quietly from Baker Street to Scotland Yard, then into the custody of a discreet committee known only to a handful of senior civil servants. From there, silence, a silence that spoke volumes. Holmes, meanwhile, made no further mention of the case. He declined invitations from the Times, ignored inquiries from the Yard, and turned his attention to obscure treatises on botanical alkaloids, as though eager to scrub his thoughts clean of what had unfolded. And yet, now and then, I would catch him gazing through the window with a particular stillness, shoulders drawn, fingers lightly pressed together, as though listening for the echo of a step that would never return. It was on the 4th morning after the delivery of Duval's final ledger that Inspector Lestrade returned to our sitting room. He arrived without fanfare, his coat sodden from a sudden shower, his expression grim and uncharacteristically subdued. He did not sit, nor did he remove his gloves. Instead, he handed Holmes a single folded document, stamped, sealed, and signed by the Home Office. Holmes opened it, read it in full silence, then placed it neatly on the mantel. "They've moved her," Lestrade said. Holmes gave a slight nod. "Where?" "South, an isolated ward near Dover, under protective supervision. They're calling it secure recovery. But between us, she'll never testify. Not publicly. Not in any court. Holmes's expression didn't change. And the ledger? Sealed. Redacted. The official story is that Helstone acted alone. Duval tried to profit. Green got in over his head. The others, the ones on the list, they're being managed. A quiet distancing, some resignations, some disappearances. Any retaliation? None, Lestrade said. Not yet. They're afraid, I think. Afraid of what else might be in your file. Holmes returned to his chair. Good. Let them be. Lestrade stood in the center of the room, uncertain for a moment. Then he turned to me. She never asked for counsel, he said. Never asked for a lawyer, a visitor, not even a coat when they moved her. She just sat there, said nothing, like it was over before it began. She knew what was coming, Holmes murmured. She had made peace with it long before we arrived. There was another silence. Then Lestrade exhaled and moved toward the door. If I hear anything, if the wind shifts, I'll send word. Holmes nodded, and the door closed behind him. Afterward, I poured 2 cups of tea, strong, hot, with a touch of lemon. I set one down beside Holmes, but he didn't reach for it. His gaze was fixed on the empty armchair across from him, the one Miss Darrow had occupied, the one Duval had died too soon to speak from, the one that now seemed to anchor something much heavier than any case could hold. She meant for it to end like this, he said at last. Not with glory, not with punishment, but with containment, a perimeter of silence. I took my seat slowly, but she failed. Holmes turned to me, and for once there was no flicker of triumph in his expression, only fatigue. Number she didn't. I frowned. But we broke the case. We uncovered the ledger. We stopped the bleeding, he interrupted. We didn't expose the wound. That remains hidden, Watson. Papered over, classified, and it will remain so until it suits someone's purpose to open it again. You think it will? He gave a small shrug. History has a habit of resurrecting buried truths. Whether for justice or leverage depends on who holds the shovel. I sipped my tea and let the words settle. Then I said, "What of Helstone?" Holmes gave a bitter smile. "He's gone. The last sighting was at a port in Santander, likely bound for Buenos Aires. He will not return. Not to this country." "And you'll let him go?" Holmes leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Would you prefer I chase him, Watson? Drag him back so he can be tried by a jury that's been briefed not to listen? So his friends, those not named in the papers, can marshal their influence in the shadows?" I said nothing. He was defeated the moment the ledger passed from Duval's dead hands into ours. Holmes continued. "He knows it. The exile is his sentence. The shame is his shadow." "But Miss Darrow," I began. "She will remain where she is," Holmes said, "not because she is powerless, but because she understands power better than any of them. She turned it sideways, used it not to destroy, but to silence. That is what made her dangerous. That is what keeps her alive." I sat back, absorbing this. Outside, a cab clattered past, the sound made distant by the drizzle still falling. The fire crackled softly. The clock marked the hour. Then Holmes stood and crossed to the Yasamam sideboard. From within, he retrieved a thin slip of paper, the last entry in Duval's private hand. He held it up to the lamplight, reading it again, not as evidence, but as testimony. "You have 3 hours," he quoted quietly. "The consequence of betrayal is silence." He folded the slip and replaced it in the satchel with the rest. Then he locked the cabinet. "I underestimated her, Watson," he said. We both did. He returned to his chair and finally reached for the tea. It had cooled slightly, but he sipped it without complaint. "Do you regret it?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer at once. "I regret the method," he said eventually, "but not the result." We said little more that day. The room held too much of the case still within it. Miss Darrow's voice lingering in the corners, Duval's uncertainty soaked into the fibers of the rug, and Green's unanswered questions folded somewhere in the documents we had returned to the yard. And as London stirred beyond the windows, oblivious to the layers of silence we had helped build, Holmes settled into his chair with a final sigh and closed his eyes. I did not wake him. Some victories, I had come to learn, ask only to be endured. It was not until a full week had passed, with the rain having finally abated and a pale winter sun settling over Baker Street, that Holmes seemed to emerge from the fog of his own thoughts. The case had concluded, but like sediment in a glass of water, its finer particles had yet to settle fully. I found him that morning not at the window, nor at his desk, but at the kitchen table, of all places, spooning eggs onto toast with the distracted air of a man considering more serious matters. He gestured to the chair across from him, and I sat. "The last strand, Watson," he said without preamble. It tugged at me. I set my tea down. "Which strand?" "The telegram," he replied. "The message that began it all. It has remained until now the one element whose source was known but whose purpose was still uncertain." "Green delivered it," I said. "Or rather, he arranged for it." "But you already deduce that—" Yes, but consider it again. The message was designed to arrive after Duval's death, a warning too late to warn, which means it was not a message for Duval at all. It was a message for us." I raised an eyebrow. "For us?" "For the reader," Holmes said, his voice sharper now. "The observer, the detective. Duval knew he would be silenced. The telegram, sent with such precise timing, was a deliberate flare in the dark. He intended it to be found, read, interpreted. Not by Lestrade, not by the Yard, but by me." I studied him. "You mean he trusted you to find the truth?" "He trusted someone," Holmes said quietly. "Or perhaps he gambled. But in that message, the consequence of betrayal is silence. You have 3 hours." He gave us his final clue. "The phrase is not a threat. It is a code, a summation. Silence is the consequence. The kind of silence Helen Darrow herself mastered. He was warning us not of a killer, but of a method." The room fell still for a moment. "He was telling us how he died," I said slowly. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, poison would have been discovered in time. A staged break-in would have raised questions, but silence, emotional, political, institutional, was the perfect blade. The kind no autopsy reveals, the kind sharpened over years." I leaned back in my chair. Then every part of this case, Duval's documents, Green's visit, Darrow's cipher, was already in motion before we arrived. Holmes gave a slight nod. It was never a question of whether we would solve it. The question was whether we would be permitted to understand why. "And now?" I asked. Holmes sipped his tea. "Now we understand." Outside, the streets of London bustled back into their rhythm. The world had not changed. Men still hurried with umbrellas and newspapers. Streetcars still clanged along the tracks, and distant bells still tolled the hour, without knowing what had passed quietly beneath their chimes. But within our modest rooms on Baker Street, something had shifted. The case had closed, not with applause or scandal, but with a deeper kind of resolution, an understanding that some truths, like telegrams, are meant to be read by the right eyes at precisely the right moment. As I gathered my coat to leave for the afternoon, Holmes called after me. "One last note, Watson." "Yes?" "File this case under the telegram that killed a man," he said, "but understand, it was not the message that killed him." I turned to look at him. It was the silence that followed, 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 that followed,